So in this section, we're moving on to belief number 6, which will bring us halfway through our survey of 12 critical Christian beliefs. And belief 6 is that sin has interrupted God's intention. Sin has interrupted God's intention. We saw in a previous section that Adam's original state was righteous. He's righteous. He's in a state of relationship with God. I think we could also say, however, that he was incomplete, only in the sense that he's called to ongoing relationship with God, just as we would say that a 5-year-old child is both perfect and incomplete. The doctor examines the child and says he's the right weight, he's the right height, he's the right vocabulary, and so on. The doctor says he's perfect. So he's both perfect but incomplete. There's still lots of room to grow. He's perfect for where he is at this time. So in the same way, the original humanity is invited to live a life of continuous growth into God's likeness. Now, growing in the likeness of God requires two unequal but equally necessary features. What do I mean by two unequal but equally necessary? Well, if you're making a cake, both eggs and flour are equally necessary, but you're not going to have the same amount of eggs and flour, typically. So there are two features that are required. They're both equally required if we're to grow, but one plays a more dominant role than the other. What's required? The presence of God is required. If we are to grow in the likeness of God, then God's activity within us is absolutely necessary. The second feature that is necessary is our willing participation as human beings. So God's presence, our willing participation are equally necessary, but God's presence plays the dominant role. We cannot will ourselves to be in the likeness of God. We cannot will ourselves to be more conformed to the image of God. This is something that God must do within us. But what we can do is position ourselves before God to allow him to work into us. Now, a couple of options are made available to Adam and Eve. And these human choices are illustrated in the Genesis narrative in the form of two trees. We have the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life is a tree that Adam and Eve can eat from. In fact, they are invited to eat from all of the trees within the garden. There's only one tree that they cannot eat from, and that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what the tree of life, what does it symbolize? What does it represent? It represents, I think, the choice to progressively reflect God's likeness by being in relationship with him. So the tree of life represents a path. It represents a path of communion with God. It represents a path of relationship with God. It's the path of the presence, which is what is required to be transformed, to be indwelt by God and changed by God by virtue of walking with him in relationship. That's the tree of life. The tree of life appears as imagery of growth and flourishing with God in later books of the Bible. We'll find the tree of life mentioned in Proverbs, in Ezekiel, in Revelation, as being a symbol of walking in the path of God in relationship with God. So how are we going to get to where we need to be? Where do we need to be? Where do we want to be? We want to be in union with God. How do we get there? Well, one path is the tree of life, is symbolized by the tree of life. The path of relationship with God. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents another path, an alternative path. It represents the choice to become like God independently of God. You'll remember that in the Genesis story, the serpent says to Adam and Eve, oh, you should eat from this tree. God doesn't want you to eat from this tree because he knows that when you eat from this tree, you will be like him. Well, being like him is the goal. It's not wrong for Adam and Eve to want to be like God. That's what they were called to. What's wrong is the path to get there, the means to get there. We will get there through our own knowledge. We will get there through our own determination as to what is good and evil. So whereas the tree of life represents the pursuit of God-likeness, we talk about godliness in the New Testament, talks about godliness. Godliness is just short form for God-likeness, being like God, not in his incommunicable attributes. There's only God is like God in that respect. But to be like God in his communicable attributes. The path to God-likeness, the proper path to God-likeness, is the tree of life. Communion with God, relationship with God, walking with God. The other path is the path of independence. I will be like God. I will be essentially my own God. I will establish my own path. I will establish my own way. And these two trees stand as symbols of choices that humanity can make. How is it? Which path will we walk? Will we walk independently of God to be our own God? Or will we walk in communion with God so that we can become truly more like him in his love, in his attributes of goodness, grace, mercy, kindness, and so forth?